Hello and welcome to the new series of Planted Unearthed. My name's Sam Peters and I'm one of the co-founders of Planted, the first contemporary design show aimed at reconnecting spaces with nature. Following the success of the first series of Planted Unearthed, we're continuing to explore how design, sustainability, architecture, food production and nature can combine to create cleaner, greener, healthier spaces. For Series 2, we want to look deeper into the issues surrounding access to nature, while trying to understand how we can work together to build a society where caring for the environment, consuming responsibly and living sustainably all come naturally. We'll continue to showcase beautiful products today which improve our tomorrow, while also trying to find answers to some of the toughest environmental questions which confront us all. In the first episode of our new series, we speak to a group of young people who are helping to bring together like-minded ecologists and nature lovers, looking to open doors for people of colour in an industry often not associated with, or indeed accessible to, the BAME community. Reuben Fakoya Brooks, a zoology graduate from Nottingham University, is the founder of the BAME Ecological Network, and Reuben is joined on Planted Unearthed today by Bushra Abu-Helil and Sullivan, who's been involved with the network since its first meeting back in September 2020. So Reuben, Bushra and Connor, welcome to Planted Unearthed.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Guys, it's great to have you here. You know, obviously we're all locked down again and back in our homes and, you know, so looking forward to meeting with you all properly, but in due course. But I mean, perhaps Reuben, as the founder of the BAME Ecology Network, perhaps you could start off, tell us a little bit about the network, how's it come about, and what are you guys trying to achieve?
Well, the network in itself will serve as like a community of expertise to help, and as a byproduct will, in a sense, act as a form of representation to inspire younger students or just naturalist people to be involved in ecology or to enroll in ecology. And it's at the beginning phases, at stages at the moment in which we are still as a team or as a group of individuals determining what we want moving forward. And we have discussed various ideas from mentorship schemes to panel discussions to setting up events with external organizations. So it's all very exciting. I think how the network begun was almost quite spontaneous. It was birthed from quite an unfortunate event with George Floyd and the events of summer 2020. And it reminded me of an aspiration I had at university, in which I wanted to almost connect people of colour within zoology. It started off as just zoology, and almost form a hub of support that I had often always saw from other, that wasn't necessarily, so hubs that had already existed weren't necessarily supportive of my needs to an extent. And being the only Black zoologist on my course, being the only Black zoologist that my supervisor had taught in his 15 years at Nottingham, that moment in summer kind of just reiterated to me that it was important, or something that was important to create. And lo and behold, my supervisor messaged me because he was contacting all the alumni of Nottingham, and he messaged me and sent a very long email discussing his thoughts about how he felt, about the riots and George Floyd and how he was shocked. And he quite bluntly asked me, what should be done to end racism or improve the sector as a whole? And at that moment, it was obviously a very big question for me to answer. At the weight of it wasn't necessarily me as an individual answering that. It was almost me as the voice of a Black person, or the voice of people of color. And I was a representative of that, and understood that he had extreme amounts of influence within the university in terms of driving change. And at that moment, I discussed the idea. It was brought forward, and through his connections with the British Ecological Society, he got me in contact with Karen Devine, which is the head of external affairs. And ever since then, she's helped the British Ecological Society help support my idea, and it's just grown exponentially, you know. And within 2 months, we had our first meeting, which Bushra and Connor involved, and ever since then, it's been like a bit crazy, to be honest. But, yeah.
Well, out of a awful situation, hopefully something really amazing has begun here, Reuben. Thanks to you and your tutors at Nottingham University. I mean, Bushra, perhaps if I could ask you how you heard about the project, and what was it that attracted you to teaming up with these guys?
Yeah, well, very similar to Reuben, I also did zoology, and I was one of 2 people of colour on my course, but it became quite apparent to me that we were very much within the minority of a minority sector as it was. So after I graduated, again, similar to Reuben, I wanted to make connections to people who were in my area of expertise, but also had similar background and similar experiences to what I have had going through my professional and academic career. So I literally just Googled UK Black zoologists, and lucky for me, Reuben had written an article 3 days prior, kind of recruiting and establishing the BAME Ecological Network. And I was like, oh, happy coincidence, fantastic. Immediately got in contact. And it just kind of went from there. And it's been a really empowering experience to have that many people of colour who are all super interested in nature, in ecology, zoology, plant scientists. It's a real diversity of people from natural sciences. And so many of us having these shared experiences, these feelings of not fitting a mold, imposter syndrome, was all just swept up together. So it was really nice to have that initial connection, to identify these barriers so that we can actually start making the changes that are needed.
And Connor, if I could come to you, you're still at university yourself. I mean, is the experiences that Bushra and Reuben have just described, can you relate to that as well, presumably?
Yeah, I can, especially if I look higher up at like the supervisors and who I'm being taught from. There is, actually tell a lie, there is quite a lot of there is a great diversity in who I'm being taught by, and even more so in a master's. But at the undergraduate level, you have got a lot less diversity. You've got fewer BAME individuals, and even less international students I've found studying zoology at the undergraduate level compared to the master's level where I'm at now. And like Reuben and Bushra, I studied zoology, and I got put in touch about the ecological network by a friend, Zanera, who's a mutual friend of Reuben. And yeah, I got in touch and got involved in the first meeting, and I've been involved since. So yeah.
Well, at Planted, we're all about reconnecting spaces with nature, but inherent in that is about reconnecting people with nature, and indeed connecting people with nature. I mean, can you guys say a little bit about, the challenges that you face, perhaps living in cities? I know, Bushra, you're a little bit more out in the rural part of Norfolk up there. But I mean, on a general level, what are some of the challenges that the BAME community face in terms of just accessing green space, accessing nature, and what are the things that can be done to change that, and what would you like to see done to change that? Reuben, if I could go to you on that one.
Growing up in the city, I'm very much like South London born and bred, and what's kind of synonymous with living in a city is naturally a disinterest in nature to some extent. It isn't necessarily promoted today. And it's not necessarily promoted in the same way as you would get if you lived in the countryside. And it's almost to some extent shunned on, or it's always looked at as a bit nasty, especially growing up. I was a bit of the oddball. I used to like picking up snails and insects, but it was very unusual to do that, especially in the city. It just wasn't seen as that important. So I think a lot of the challenges that just naturally comes with being in a city, but as a Black person too, nature within Britain isn't, well, when I was younger, wasn't necessarily promoted to me as something that I should be accessing in a way. Mm-hmm. And it was just by chance that I had individuals in my family that were very passionate about nature. My grandma is a botanist, basically. She loves plants, loves gardening, and she encouraged me because she saw I liked nature to be involved in gardening with her. My dad is also, he's a lawyer, but he loves watching David Attenborough documentaries and such, and he definitely encouraged me to pursue that when I was younger, just to pursue that interest. But away from that, naturally, like it's not necessarily as accommodating, especially in a city, for just the natural scape or the natural environment to an extent. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
And Connor, if I could ask you about that as well. I mean, in terms of growing up in a city, you know, the challenges I mean, how difficult is it for you sometimes to actually, if you want to go and find some green space or access nature, like what do you do in order to try and achieve that?
I mean, I think in London, or at least where I'm based in Hackney, it's quite easy to find green space because there's such an abundance of it. You've got great parks. I've got Haggerston Park by me. I've got Victoria Park, London Fields. But I was quite similar to Reuben, you know, that odd kid picking up snails and rummaging through leaflet or whatever. And I guess, I don't know, it's that, what's difficult is using that green space in that kind of way, and then not feeling weird or like as you're being watched and like you shouldn't be using that space in that way as such. Because I've definitely, out of all my friends, I don't know many people that of colour or white that would use the green space as I would or as I'd want to use it. So I guess that's the only challenge, but access to green space in general is pretty easy, at least where I am.
Bushra, I know you're up in kind of fairly rural part of Norfolk, and you're blessed with some beautiful weather, which we haven't been blessed with today, but quite a different place to grow up and to be in many ways. More easily accessible sort of spaces, I guess, although totally taking on board what Connor just said about there are obviously some amazing green spaces in cities as well. But as a person of colour growing up in the countryside or living in the countryside as you do now, what are some of the challenges that you might face perhaps which perhaps a white person would not?
So I grew up in the countryside as well as living here now. I've loved living in it. And I think one of the things that really helped me is the fact that I could have that initial inspiring connection to nature just because of my surroundings. The fact that I wasn't necessarily having to go to a park to access green spaces. I could just walk down the road and I'd be in a forest or somewhere that was a lot more secluded or by a river. And it really helps you to get that first connection to nature. And I really think that's what helps to inspire people to have a deeper interest in it and then potentially take it further and make a career out of it as well. But I still definitely face different challenges. Being the only non-white person in my school, one of the very few people of colour in the entire area, always made things challenging. Like I always very much felt like the odd one out. But that probably did help me in this industry because, as I said, once I got to university, I was again one of only two people of colour. But for me, I was like, well, I'm actually used to this. So I definitely learned to build some resilience when living in these areas, but it's definitely a daunting prospect even for me. I'm really into birding, and I like to go to quite a few different places to do birding. And very rarely do I see another black or brown face when I go there. Everyone else is usually white, typically over 60, and they can stare at you when you turn into a bird box. People also can make the assumption that you might not necessarily be as aware of the nature. I'm a very expressive person, and I think that goes for a lot of other women of color in general. If I see something exciting in nature, I'm going to be excited about it. So I also don't think, so also being able to like express your excitement is like a whole other area when you're going into these public places, such as like bird watching huts, to be able to have that kind of freedom just to be yourself whilst you're actually enjoying nature as well. But like I said, because I grew up in an environment where I was always the odd one out and always what, I've kind of just learned to accept myself and just to be myself. But for people who haven't grown up with that experience, it can be a very daunting prospect.
Yeah. I mean, Reuben, why do you think that is? I mean, I was reading some statistics, in fact, from Nick Hayes' book, the Book of Trespass, which we were talking about before we came on the call, but a book which I'm finding really informative personally, as with Guy Shrubsole's Who Owns England as well, which again we talked about before we started recording. But a statistic I read in Nick's book, 9% of the UK population are from an ethnic minority background, but only constitute 1% of visitors to the countryside. And Trevor Phillips, of course, a race campaigner who many people in the UK will know, once spoke of what he described as a passive apartheid in the UK countryside. I mean, is that a kind of expression that would chime with you, Reuben? And what do you think was meant by that? And why do people of colour not go to the countryside in the UK? I know that's a massive question, but in your experience, what would you say maybe some of the factors involved?
So historically, the countryside hasn't necessarily been that safe. City centres were the hubs of a lot of migrants, and as you kind of left those city centres, as you see elsewhere, it becomes much more, you as a minority becomes much more extreme. And historically, it wasn't necessarily very safe to leave those almost hubs of safety within city centres and just within the cityscape. And I feel like that's just been passed down. Like if I were to go to the countryside, my grandparents or maybe my dad would have a bit of apprehension because it's just viewed as, oh well, there's not really any black people around or people of colour, and if something happens to you, you're not really going to find any support. And so that does have a very big effect on just generally as a person of colour, you perceiving the countryside as something as accessible. If you just naturally associate that with something of not danger, but you're almost like it's something that may not be safe to an extent. And I think another influence is that just naturally in the UK, the countryside isn't promoted to people of colour, or historically hasn't really been promoted to people of colour. And it's always been whitewashed to an extent. It's always been viewed as true Britain, and true Britain isn't necessarily deemed as or has the face of a person of colour. And you see that now, where it's always kinds of rumbles up when that very extreme nationalism is associated to an image of Britain that was quite racist at the time. And just by having that image and just labeling the countryside as that, it's just very off-putting, just naturally. You almost kind of surpass that hurdle. A lot of people don't surpass that to just enjoy what comes with the countryside, which is a shame.
Bushra, as someone, as you say, who grew up in the countryside, and obviously you'll know a lot about things like access rights and where you can and can't go. Ordnance survey maps are a sort of pet obsession of mine, I must admit, of sort of where the public is allowed to go. Is that are those limitations and those kind of restrictions, which honestly, you know, as a white man living in the countryside, it can sometimes be quite daunting. My dad recently got told off for literally straying off a path, and he didn't, you know, a 76-year-old white man, and he's getting told off, and it's like, you know, just by complete accident. So I can relate to that. You know, as a person of colour, who, as you've described, is going to be in a minority situation, coming to country, living in the countryside. Can you sort of relate a little bit to the difficulties and the kind of perceptions that go hand in hand with literally the rights of way of where people are allowed to go?
Definitely. I mean, I remember at school before summer, we would always have people come in and teach us the countryside code so that we would get to know it from a very young age, specifically before summer, because they assume that you're going to be out playing in the fields and doing whatever. But I imagine a lot of people in the cities are not exposed to that same kind of like the rules and regulations of the countryside. And I also think that there is an issue if you do happen to wander off a path, for example, not because of disrespect, it could just purely be out of ignorance. People will assume that you are doing it out of disrespect or a lack of knowledge, and therefore people have a lot worse perception of you and will have a lot worse reaction because they think that you don't necessarily understand where you are or what the natural surroundings are, when actually that isn't the case. But this is quite often an assumption that will be made, particularly of people of colour, that they're doing something perhaps out of disrespect or a lack of knowledge, when actually they haven't been exposed to the countryside code. They didn't know that that's only meant for horses and not meant for people walking as well. So yeah, I think there just needs to be a little bit of some relaxation of people in the countryside to be a little bit more helpful. And I think, like Reuben said, more accessibility for things like the countryside code, so that people can be more familiar with what the rules are, and how to act and behave. But just coming back onto the thing you were saying about access to the countryside, particularly from people of cities, a really, really big issue is also just transport in general. Yeah. So 94% of people that visit the national parks do so by car. And a lot of people who are living in cities, they have no need for a car, and therefore they do not have one. So again, there's an additional barrier there, because public access transports are not always great. Buses in my area come once an hour if they turn up.
Yeah, no, I get that. That makes a lot of sense for sure. I mean, Connor, maybe I could ask you, as somebody who's grown up and lives in the city now, the countryside code, is that something that's kind of come over your radar at all, or onto your radar?
Not at all. I mean, where I went to Sussex University, I mean, that's situated on the South Downs, and I'm not sure how applicable the rights of way are there, and if they're the same as where Bushra is, but there was definitely times where I'm wandering around the Downs and like, oh, should I go there? Should I not go there? So yeah, there's definitely that barrier. And even if you're walking down a path, like a lane, and you come up to a house, like, can I go past that house? Like, can I go on the field? Yeah, there's definitely barriers there to me and probably every other student at the university. So yeah.
I think this is it's a really interesting subject, this, and one that I think we're going to come back to time and time again. But I mean, you know, if I may just share my experience very briefly, but having moved from the city, I grew up in South London, not too far from you, Reuben, and moved to northwest London, up near Harlesden, where I lived for several years with my wife and daughter, and then we moved out to the countryside down to Wiltshire not too long ago. And you know, as I say, I find it daunting myself sometimes, and I've got all these maps, and I love reading maps, and so I can completely understand like people who maybe don't live here or haven't experienced the countryside, you know, how important it is for kind of perhaps an education piece to be done here. And I don't know if that's something that you guys might end up looking at and working with it. And we'd certainly love to help you at Planted, you know, if in any way we can, to support your members and sort of, you know, help with enabling access to nature. And I guess, you know, one other thing we're really interested in, one of many other things we're really interested in, is also this idea that cities and the countryside shouldn't just be seen as completely different entities. and that actually, you know, we all need to make them work together in order for society to function, whether that be through how we access our food, or understanding where food is produced and how it's produced. And Reuben, if I could just come back to you, but perhaps on that one, I mean, how do you see that sort of relationship between city and country evolving? And again, sort of on the kind of educational side, you know, your network now, what do you see the kind of aims being really, and what would you like to see achieved in the next few years? I know you've said you're still in the process of kind of formulating those ideas, but have you got some objectives in mind that you guys would like to achieve?
Yeah, I think successfully breaking down that barrier between cityscapes and the countryside, I think that's definitely an aim going forward, and I think it's easily achievable. You know, it's not hard integrating some form of teaching into the curriculum that exists, you know, in the countryside. If you go to a school in the countryside, I don't understand why it can't necessarily be transferred into a classroom in the city. And simple things like that going forward will just naturally erode almost this perception of the countryside being this otherly world in a city, and it's something that's accessible. And there are aspects of the countryside that do exist within London. You go to Richmond Park.
Absolutely, yeah.
You are exposed to a similar experience as you were going to, you know, the Lakeside district, or an aspect of, you know, wilderness within the UK. Mm-hmm. And just by showcasing that within schools, and hopefully as a network going forward, almost making those experiences accessible to you know, young people, you know, young kids, people of color, you know, or just naturally as kids, just in general, and almost bridging that gap, and having schemes in the future to just break down what the perception of the countryside, and yeah, just to make it much more accessible, and you know, going forward. But yeah, I'm definitely just looking towards the future. I definitely see it much more positively. I think even now having this conversation, it highlights how things have changed quite dramatically since when I was, well, only 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was in primary school, in secondary school to an extent. So I just see things improving, not regressing. Yeah.
And I guess on a kind of small scale for younger people, you know, you guys in your 20s now, and but perhaps for teenagers growing up in cities, perhaps a message to them might be that, you know, nature is accessible everywhere, isn't it? Although we think about in the UK, perhaps, and this may well change, and hopefully it will, as you described there, Reuben, very well, breaking down those barriers and that sort of that definition between countryside and city. But you know, we can all access nature everywhere, wherever we are in the city or indeed in the countryside. What are your thoughts on that, Reuben? I know when you were growing up, you sort of used to find small spaces where you could find nature.
I would say there are always, I think, even if you can't visit the almost like the prime example of what the countryside is. You know, go to the Lake District or the Peak District, or go to, you know, the Kent countryside, and, you know, be exposed to overt examples of what the British countryside is. There are examples or experiences you can have in the city. You know, for example, I had recently been involved in an outreach project with my friend, and she set up a STEM club for working class children that don't necessarily have the opportunity to visit these places. And I did insect putter experiment where you suck up insects. And when I got there, it was in a nursery, and there's no greenery. It was a little patch of grass, like that was cut, a shed in the garden, like a shed and a little playground. But in that space, I understood that there is still a hub of, or an ecosystem that can be accessible. And if you just change that perception of something that seems quite stale and make it much more, and investigate the insects that you see every day in a different light, you can inspire children, or inspire that, create almost a mysticism in a green space that doesn't necessarily perceived in the same light as the countryside. And I feel like that happened to me all the time when I was younger, when my grandma lives in a council estate, and she doesn't have grass in a garden. She has plant pots. She uses big plant pots. And within those massive plant pots, I was exposed to nature. I was exposed to ecosystems that I used to dream of being like the Amazon, and that it was like my mini Amazon. And I think that going forward, it's just changing the perception of what the city is, and this mini green spaces that do exist everywhere into something that is very reminiscent of how we perceive the countryside. And then going forward, that may just help break down the barriers and the accessible barriers going forward, just between the city and the countryside. But yeah.
Well, that is a wonderfully descriptive way of explaining how the countryside, or nature indeed, is accessible in every part of wherever you may be. And indeed, if you don't have it in front of you, then you can encourage nature into small spaces, on a windowsill, or on your on a balcony or a patio. You know, encourage nature at all times, and that's a wonderful description, Reuben, that you've just given of that dream of the Amazon. Because what nature does, it fires your imagination, and it connects you in a way that perhaps we can't connect if we're just looking at cars and concrete everywhere we go. So guys, thank you so much. I'd love to speak to you for all day. I think you're a fantastic group of people at Planted. We want to give you guys all the support that we can as you move forward in growing your ecologist network. We think it's a fantastic project, and we're really grateful for you taking your time to speak to us on Planted Unearthed today. So thank you all for being with us today. Really grateful to you. So that just leaves it for me to say, if you've enjoyed today's series of Planted Unearthed, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, details of which can be found on our website, www.planted-cities.co.uk. On there, you'll find more great interviews and editorial content from some of the leading writers and thinkers in the world of design, sustainability, nature, architecture, and food production. While you should also look out for some exciting news about our events programme coming soon in 2021. One of those collaborations has already been firmly established with Horticus, whose wonderful modular planting system I'm sitting in front of in the Planted studio for the first time today. That just leaves it to me to say thanks again to the guys from the British Ecological Society, BAME Ecological Network. Thanks to our friends at Horticus, Tom Howe for producing the music, and thanks to you for watching. And if you are a person of colour, from me living in the countryside, do come and visit. You are welcome. And learn the countryside code. We all need to learn the countryside code. And thanks to all you guys. It's been a fantastic interview, and I'm just delighted that you've been part of it with us today. So my name's Sam Peters, and this has been Planted Unearthed.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. All the best.
No worries.